Good afternoon from Tokyo, Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development. Thank you very much for joining our seminar titled Reimagining Migration Policy Towards a New Vision for the Age of Fragmentation, co-hosted by Japan's National Institute of Population and Social Security Research, namely IPSS, and the JICA Ogata Research Institute. I am Akutsu Kentaro, the Executive Senior Research Fellow of the JICA Ogata Research Institute. I will be your chair today. So now, let me introduce our 5 distinguished speakers and panelists today. First, Professor Christian Joppke, Professor Emeritus, the University of Bern, Switzerland. The next, Professor Mine Yoichi, Executive Director of the JICA Ogata Research Institute. Next, Professor Graciela Liufara, Professor of Waseda University. And next, Dr. Korekawa Yu, Director of the International Relations Department, IPSS. Also, and then we will invite Professor Hein de Haas, Professor of the University of Amsterdam, Netherlands, via online later. So first, let me invite Ms. Hayashi Reiko, the Director General of IPSS, to give the opening remarks of this event. So, Madam Hayashi, please.
Dear participants, good afternoon. My name is Reiko Hayashi, and I serve as the Director General of the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research. Allow me to say a few words on the occasion of today's seminar. Thank you very much for attending the jointly organized seminar by the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research and the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development, titled IPSS Annual Seminar Development Cooperation Seminar Reimagining Migration Policy Towards a New Vision for the Age of Fragmentation. Today, the world is experiencing significant divisions concerning migration issues. International migration, which had declined to levels not seen since the Second World War due to the COVID-19 pandemic, has surged again on the unprecedented scale since 2022 as the pandemic has begun to subside. The background to this is complex. In many sending countries, or source countries, the economy had already been sustained by remittances from migrants even before COVID-19. When the pandemic led to border closures, these economies faced crisis, prompting a dramatic resurgence in immigration in efforts to recover. As a result, it is not uncommon to see countries like Sri Lanka and Jamaica experiencing temporary population declines. On the other hand, in receiving countries, the situation is also evolving. In Europe, for example, immigrants have long occupied for 10 to 20% of the population. United Kingdom's withdrawal of EU or Brexit over disagreements regarding immigration policy marked a new chapter in European policy history. More recently, anti-immigrant governments have come to power in countries such as Italy and Hungary, while political parties calling for stricter immigration controls are gaining ground in many countries, including France and Sweden. Across the Atlantic in the United States, the Trump administration's immigration restrictions continue to unfold. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the military regime in Myanmar have also triggered waves of migration and refugee flows. To better understand these global developments, we are honored to welcome today 2 leading scholars in international migration studies, Professor Hein de Haas of the University of Amsterdam, a foremost authority in the field, and Professor Christian Joppke of University of Bern, a renowned expert in migration policy and citizenship studies. As an introduction, Mr. Yu Korekawa, Director of the International Relations Development of our Institute, and Dr. Kiyoko Saito, Senior Research Fellow, JICA Ogata Research Institute, will introduce the aims of the seminar. Following the keynote lectures, we will hold a panel discussion with Professor Graciela Liufara of Waseda University, a leading scholar in migration studies in Japan, and Dr. Yuichi Mine, director of the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute, as one of our co-hosts. We look forward to deepening our understanding through discussions with all participants. Migration is undoubtedly a key theme in interpreting the future of global affairs. I hope that today's seminar will deepen our understanding of international migration and related issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madam Hayashi. So next agenda is introduction number 1. So let me invite Dr. Korekawa, please.
So, I would like to give you the input for today's seminar. We are awaiting 2 keynote speeches, but before, maybe I should give you the situation in Japan, and that is why I'm giving you the outline. The title is Immigration Policy of Japan, the way we have come and the way we will go. Today, we are talking about the migration policy, so I would like to speak to this topic. Now, the Japanese immigration policy, I could say 4 facts. First, Japan has been considered to be a closed and homogeneous society for many years, but because of the 4 contradicting facts, I would like to mention. First of all, Japan accepts more than 300,000 net immigrants every year. This is a fact, especially post-COVID. After 2020, we have been seeing this continuously. Second fact, that Japan has established SSW program, which will enable more than 300,000 skilled or semi-skilled workers to attain permanent residency in a few years. Currently, we have close to 300,000 semi-skilled workers, which is called SSW1, that exists more than 10,000, and they will be shifting their course to SSW2, which allows them to have access to permanent residency. And also, after 1990s, we have many foreigners coming in, and they are obtaining permanent residency every year, and they are gradually integrated into Japanese society. And also, looking at the international situation, due to economic growth of Asian countries, we expect that they are aiming to come to Japan in the future more. So let's move on to each fact. Now, fact number 1. This indicates the flow of people on a global basis. What is most important here is international immigration center is here in Asia. In Asia, Persian Gulf countries, they are attracting more migrants than those to the US from Asia. If you look at this chart, from Asia to North America, 19,000 or more people, a million or more people are going there. But vis-a-vis Gulf countries, 25 million people are moving to Gulf countries. And also within Asia, 390,000 people. That is far more than 45,201,000 that is within Europe. So as I said, Asia is a center of international migration, and this is only looking at Asia. From Asia, every year, 5.2 million labor are flowing out from Asian countries, and close to half are destined to Gulf countries. And remaining maybe slightly over 2 million people, they are going to advanced nations. And Japan is in fact the biggest recipient, meaning Japan first and second US and the third Korea in this order. In other words, from Asian countries, we are the biggest or largest recipient of international migration. So as you can see, recently, Japan has been experiencing inflow of foreign migrants, but this has gone through a lot of change in the history. This is the situation after Meiji Restoration in terms of international migration. The line in red is the Japanese expats, and the green is former colonial origin foreign residents who are more or less the Koreans living in Japan, and blue indicates newcomer foreigners, so to speak. Prior to the war, in a nutshell, Japan was a country of immigration. 2.6 million Japanese expats lived abroad, and 1.3 million colonial origin migrants lived in the Japanese archipelago. And after the war, Japan lost overseas colonies, and most Japanese expats returned to Japan, and also colonial origin migrants returned to their countries. And until 1980s, the international migration was kept constantly low. And after 1990s, you see a surge in blue lines, meaning that we see some people coming from abroad, but 1990, we have more foreign residents than the Japanese experts. So we have therefore become migration transition experienced nation sometime in 1990s. So this is a site, and according to the OECD statistics, this is annual net migration among OECD member countries. We rank as number 10 according to this data. You may think this is a huge number, or maybe not. However, for last year, we had about 360,000 people, and that is actually on par with Spain. So we might have ranked as number 6th, which is on par with the 5th ranking country. Japan is a larger population, therefore the impact on total population may be small. However, in terms of absolute number of receiving migrants, we are receiving a lot already. Now, secondly, SSW program allows semi-skilled migrants to establish permanent residency. So they are able to stay in Japan permanently. So this is a second fact. In Japan, we were considered to be the country which doesn't give any permission to residency in Japan to foreigners. However, we had several routes. One is at the art. This is the route for white-collar people who are graduate of university, and also a manual work, which is below that the academic experience. So after the graduating university, they can be a highly skilled worker and to get permanent residency. Japan has a higher retention rate of foreign students working in Japan. Non-English speaking OECD member, we are the largest destination country for students. So they are able to get permanent residency through this route in the past. Now we have the second route, which is newly created. We used to have TITP, where you can work either to 3 to 5 years before returning to your home country. But in 2018, we introduced the SSW. So SSW1 and SSW2, there were two new resident status given. And so that means up to 5 years. And then if the skill examination was passed, they can become SSW2 status. And this has no renewal limit. And by staying here in Japan for a certain period of time, they can apply for permanent residency. So if you are a high-skilled worker graduating from university, which is actually allowing to be a residency, which is done by many countries, but 290,000 people are living in Japan already for middle-skilled people. And giving them training and to put them onto permanent residency, I think that path is not so much offered by many countries. So in a way, we are kind of unique. And the third is more migrants are establishing permanent residence every year, and they are becoming moderately integrated into society. This is fact 3. This is something I discovered from my study. We are experiencing gradual integration through education process. Of course, there are various challenges and issues. However, international study, work, and permanent residency, this stepwise movement allows foreigners to integrate it into Japanese society. Dr. Liu Fowler's study also made this point very clear as well. And this chart indicated very clearly 920,000 people are living as a permanent resident foreigner, and there's an increase by 26 or 27,000 people. And from 2016 to 2020, we checked what sort of residency they come when they came to Japan for the first time. 20% study, and also the people who graduated from university overseas, and they came as engineers and so on and so forth, that accounted for 8%. So about 50% of the people who came to Japan for the first time to live had a permanent residency through work or through education. So what is making this possible? 1988, the Agency for Economic Planning created this chart of employment of migrants in Japanese employment system, so-called Japanese employment system, which actually employ people in lump sum after graduating university, so that they are joined the company and then go through training. Kind of Japanese type of employment was considered to be not fitted for foreign workers. However, after 2000, foreign students started joining the Japanese companies, and then within the company they are promoted so that they can form their families and they can get their permanent residency. Those routes have become very clear, and that is because of the SSW system, allowing for SSW program people to get residency. So they may be manual workers after graduating high school, and they become a management member, and that is possible in a Japanese employment system, and this is now open for non-Japanese workers as well. Through external work market, compared to a foreign market that uses the external market or job hopping, I think a Japanese employment market is more suitable for highly skilled and highly motivated non-Japanese workers to join into the Japanese society, so-called membership employment system. This may actually allow higher retention rate of foreign students once joined the Japanese company. So that is what is a factor we can consider. Now, fact number 4, the economic growth of Asian countries is expected to attract more people to Japan in the future. This is Professor de Haas's capability aspiration model. Point here is with the Asian economic growth, they would come to Japan more. And the detail will be explained by Dr. de Haas after this, so please look forward. And this is much more interesting. That is according to Gallup of the US. This is the popularity of a destination for highly educated people in Asia. Japan, after 2009, we become more popular. After 2010 or 2015, Japan became a popular destination. US, Saudi Arabia are only above us. And there is a characteristic that we are popular for highly educated people than graduate of high school. And this is JICA's research results. We asked foreign workers about, this is the forecast for the foreign workers. As capability aspiration model indicates, I think we would have to expect more people from foreign countries to come and work in Japan. So according to the conclusion, is Japan becoming a country of immigration under the neoliberalism? And what is going to be the impact for the Japanese society? So I would like to conclude as following. Well, this is not a conclusion, but this will be question to keynote speakers who will appear today. But is Japan becoming a country of immigration? Is one question. My answer would be yes, but how should we interpret the current situation is my first question to the keynote speaker. And is the process under neoliberalism? Is my second question. According to my understanding, partially the answer is yes. However, SSW, how are we going to interpret the position given to SSW is a bit of a difficult question, because we are not here just to use neoliberalism idea of selecting people depending on the capability. And so I would like to have Professor Joppke to speak after this. And this is all from me. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Korekawa. So let's move on to the next agenda. Let me invite Dr. Saito Kiyoko, Senior Research Fellow, JICA Ogata Research Institute, for introduction number 2. So Dr. Saito, please.
Okay, everyone, my name is Kiyoko Saito, and thank you for being here today to discuss one of the most pressing issues of our time, global migration. As nations grapple with rapidly aging populations and shrinking workforces, accepting migrants is indispensable for sustaining economic growth and social welfare. According to estimates by the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute, Japan will need approximately 6.88 million migrant workers by 2040 to cope with a projected labor shortage of 970,000. New approaches like matching skills to destination countries' needs are emerging, but we must remember it is human beings, not just skills, that migrate. At JICA, we believe the concept of human security, putting people at the center, is essential as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of mobility. Next, please. Tragically, threats to the lives, livelihoods, and dignity of migrants are growing more severe. IOM reports 32,125 deaths or disappearances in the Mediterranean since 2014, the highest globally. But Asia is not immune, with a staggering 9,191 lives lost in 2024, a nearly 1.7-fold rise since 2040. Next, please. The causes are numerous, from drowning to violence to lack of health care. Next, please. While deaths have declined in the Mediterranean, Asia has been alarming rise, with deaths in 2024 nearly triple that of 2014. Deaths from violence have decreased in the Mediterranean, but Asia has witnessed a staggering rise in reported deaths on those attributed to sickness or lack of health care. Over 1,500 Rohingya and Bangladesh migrants have died at the sea between 1214 and 1219, with nearly 200 bodies discovered in mass grave along the Thai-Malaysia border in 2015. Vehicle accident and violence at the Pakistan-Iran border are also significant causes of death. These shocking statistics underscore the urgent need for regional cooperation and safe, regular migration pathways. Next, please. Meanwhile, human trafficking remains a scourge. Cases persist in many nations and have nearly doubled in Japan from 25 in 2014 and 48 in 2022. Next, please. Human security offers a framework to address the complex web of threats we face. Imagine three nested circles: the physical realm of natural disasters and climate change, the ecological sphere of pandemic and agricultural disruptions, and the social world of war, poverty, and hunger. These threats are deeply intertwined, each amplifying the other. The migration crisis epitomizes this. Climate change undermines livelihoods, driving people to seek opportunities abroad, but upon arrival, they face new threats like social tension and trafficking. The human security approach aims to tackle these interconnected threats holistically. Next. The UN has adopted key resolution on human security, and Japan has championed it as a guiding principles of development cooperation. By embracing human security, we can address the true needs of the most vulnerable, recognizing each person as an agent of change. We must ask, what does a resilient society look like that can uphold human security under any circumstances? Next, please. So, what kind of society embodies human security and demonstrated high resilience in protecting people's lives, livelihoods, and dignity, regardless of the circumstances? What I would like to everyone to consider is, what approach can we take to realize such a society? One key question is how we can create a society that safeguards the lives, livelihoods, and dignity of people, especially those facing severe threats or at high risk of facing threats. Protecting people from threats is undeniably essential. But isn't society where people solve problems on their own equally important? In other words, empowering people is just as important as protecting them, and it's crucial that we become a society capable of achieving this. To do so, we need an approach that emphasizes the context of each country and region and is customized according to the history, culture, social structure, and values of the people living there. Furthermore, realizing this requires solidarity through a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder engagement. The key is for not just the migrants themselves, but all people and organizations involved to work together comprehensively. And in undertaking these efforts, the society should always identify potential risks, considering the possibility that the situation could rapidly deteriorate due to the threats. In other words, the possibility of downside risk and preventively address those risks. Next, please. Building on this understanding, JICA has pioneered applying the human security framework since 2003 by integrating human security in 20 sector strategies from urban development to health to governance. JICA ensures protects effectively respond to people's true needs, particularly the most marginalized. As we harness this strategy to address migrants' challenges at every stage, we must continue prioritizing the protection and empowerment of individuals and communities. JICA is advancing initiatives to promote respect for migrant workers' rights, build migrant capacities, and foster inclusive society. However, we must consider whether these approaches are truly contributing to human security for migrants as human beings, deserving of dignity, safety, and opportunity beyond their economic roles. My research team, which studies international migration decision-making mechanisms, has uncovered noteworthy insights. Through field research and a survey of nearly 7,000 prospective migrants and communities in Indonesia, we observed that while Japan maintains its positive national image, those living near people with actual work experience in Japan are less likely to choose Japan as their destination. This suggests Japan may be a dream country that admired from afar, but not actually selected for work. This finding points to important issues in Japanese society that are not readily apparent from the outside, and we are currently examining this more closely. We must re-evaluate our efforts to ensure they comprehensively address migrants' multidimensional needs and aspirations. Next, please. The human security approach encourages us to prioritize the inherent dignity and potential of migrants, ensuring access not only workplace rights, but also to education, healthcare, social services, and opportunities for personal growth. As we envision the future of migration, let us strive for a world where migration is choice, not a necessity, where the rights and dignity of migrants are respected at every stage, and where the benefits of mobility are equitably shared. By cooperating in solidarity and shared responsibility, we can achieve meaningful progress toward a more just, inclusive, and sustainable future for all. This is what we wish to reflect upon with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saito. So now let me invite our first keynote speaker, Professor Christian Joppke, so to share his views on neoliberal migration policy. So Professor Joppke, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you to those who invited me, young rising scholar Takeshi Mihai. I'm humbled that you trust that coming from afar I have something useful to say about migration policy. If you can move the slide, here's the marching order, the overview. The main argument is, I'm afraid, an academic argument, because what I'm presenting here, well, I'm an academic, is a paper still under review. For 5 months now, actually, I don't have a positive answer yet, so there's no guarantee that I will not be telling nonsense to you. Bear with me. And the argument is economics and culture, or utility and identity considerations, which used to be logically and empirically separate criteria for selecting and integrating migrants, are no longer separate criteria. There is a fusion between utility identity, a fusion between economic and cultural considerations when a state has to decide whom to admit and how to integrate migrants. And I call that new constellation, where these two previously separate criteria become blurred or fused. I call that neoliberal migration policy, also the title of this presentation. My focus here, simply because it's the focus of this little paper that I'm relying on, is on the selection side, that is on immigration policy proper. It's not my consideration to talk about the integrating of migrants, even though that is an equally important challenge. That's always the dual challenge with respect to migration, how to select and how to integrate. I only talk about the selection, and also I think that is your main interest here. But I would claim that some of the same patterns, neoliberalization, that is, can also be identified on the integration side. So 7 steps, and I hope to be in time. The first one is a bit of the academic side. I will question whether there's really a liberal paradox when states decide about migration. I will tell you what it is. It is one of the key theoretical themes underlying the scholarship on immigration policy since 30 years now, and it's closely identified with the name of esteemed colleague, Jim Holyfield, who has introduced the term. I'm not so sure the term is helpful, particularly not helpful to understand this new constellation of the fusion of previously separate criteria of selection. And indeed, the second step then is to tell you a little bit about this new constellation of blurring of the previously separate economics versus culture divide. And I try to make sense of this new empirical constellation in terms of, I think, we have a new form of nationalism that is informing states in this domain, and I call it neoliberal nationalism, also the title of a previous book of mine. And I illustrate the workings of neoliberal nationalism along 3 aspects of or 3 types of migration policy, which are also the 3 dominant criteria of how states today select migrants on the basis of we need workers for our economy, and there's a clear focus in the neoliberal order for in terms of we prefer high-skilled migrants over low-skilled migrants. And a second aspect is family migration, and a third one is asylum migration. And my claim is in all of these 3 dominant sectors of immigration policy, you find similar patterns of the blurring of economic and cultural considerations when you select these 3 different types of migrants: labor migrants, family migrants, and asylum. Yeah, and I'm closing with a mandate that I got from my inviting party here to talk a little bit about the future of migration policy. As an academic, you don't talk about the future, but I try to fulfill my duty here. And lessons for Japan, I have a big question mark here, because I do think what I'm going to tell you is quite specific to the European constellation or North Atlantic constellation, and Japan is different in important respects, and perhaps you will see your own specificity in light of that rather different story I'm telling you about Europe and North America. So if you move the slide to my first point, the liberal paradox. The gray imminence for all of us political scientists or sociologists who study migration is Ari Solberg. He wrote not terribly much, but probably the best book ever on the American immigration experience over the last 150 years or so. And he's more of a historian, always very concrete and very careful not to overload his observations with too much jargon. But when he was in the mood of jargonizing a bit or kind of generalizing a bit, he argued, indeed, when states select migrants, they have two different toolboxes or selection criteria. One he calls the identity axis. The other one he didn't give it a name really in terms of he should also call it some sort of axis. No, the approximate term I found in his work is if states don't select on the basis of are people close enough to who we are, then they select people on the basis of they are useful for us because they fulfill jobs, say, that other domestic people do not want or cannot fulfill. He called that material conditions. One could call it the economic axis, even though that is a term that you do not find in Solberg. And interestingly, it's very complex, this reasoning. He argued that each of these two axes, cultural, economic, can have two expressions. It can be restrictive, kind of closed to migration, or it can be inclusive, that is migrant-friendly, as it were. So each axis has two poles, an open, liberal pole, and a closed, restrictive pole. And he is the master of the historian of the history of American migration, and he could then show that U.S. legal migration policy has always been dominated by identity concerns. And the big break here was 1965. Before 1965, you had an immigration policy called the National Origins System that selected migrants on the basis of their race and their ethnic origins. Newcomers had to be similar to those who were already in the US, grosso modo, North European migrants first and foremost, and less, if at all, Catholics and Jews. So this is, of course, if you select people on that basis, by origins, as I called it in one book, then this is identity-driven. And also after 1965, when under the influence of civil rights and student movements, the United States had to abandon its racist kind of identity. It became more civic liberal. Then also when a new system now was actually giving country quota, an equal number of migrants from all countries in the world. And that was kind of, the idea was this is not discriminatory. It is not selecting on the basis of race. Each country has the same, country in the world has the same chance to send newcomers to America. I will not talk about the subterraneous motivations, which were not so completely decoupled from racial, ethnic considerations, but also that was selecting on the basis of identity. No, America saw itself as a freedom country, as bringing liberal democracy to all over the world, and it was not a change of policy that was driven by utility, by economic considerations, but by more cultural identity considerations. Okay, that's Solberg. Masterful stuff. No, why do you move here? That was my spastic arm movements here. I will be short on this because it's a little bit too academic. Coming to the liberal paradox, Jim Holyfield introduced the term. It is motivated by a very similar consideration as Solberg, that identity and culture on the one side and economics on the other side are kind of separate criteria when states have to decide about whom to admit as a newcomer. However, in his vision or in his model, these two axes are in a way monochrome. Each axis is monochrome. The identity culture axis is always kind of restrictive. The economic axis is always exclusive. To me, this is a bit problematic and not making this notion so useful to understand real-world policies. There are two versions to the liberal paradox, and I don't think that is helpful for you to go into that. I actually have, for anyone interested, the paper and you consult it then. I leave it with a paradox here and move on to the next slide. Yeah, several scholars, and in a way what I'm doing in this paper is not terribly original, it's kind of summarizing new insights, empirical insights by people who study contemporary migration policies. And two of these very interesting scholars is Jennifer Elric of McGill University in Canada and her Canadian-German colleague Elke Winter. They argued very much in my kind of confirming my intuition or the argument that I'm presenting here, that utility and identity, and indeed they use these two terms, are no longer, as they call it, logically distinct concerns in migration policy. And this nice little paper of the year 2017 looks primarily at recent German labor migration policy, and they interpret this policy as an instance of national middle class building. This is their term. And the primary example they discuss in this paper is Germany's new penchant or kind of drive towards admitting high-skilled migrants, which started sometime in the 1990s and was something completely new in Germany. Because before that moment, Germany was like Japan before its recent developments that my predecessor just marvelously outlined. It said, wir sind kein Einwanderungsland. We are not an immigration country. And that changed when there was the perceived need actually for high-skilled migrants. And according to these two scholars, this is not just a utility considerations. If Germany now moved to high-skill migration, gave up its old self-designation as not an immigration country, it was also identity-driven, that is following the project of what they call national middle-class building. There's another example in the paper that exemplifies this national middle-class orientation of this new direction of German labor migration policy, that we see these spouses, that is the spouses of mostly male migrants coming from rich developed countries like Japan or South Korea or United States, they were exempted from the new civic integration tests that mostly global South migrants were subordinated to. In a way, their national origins coming from rich societies qualified them quasi-automatically for middle-class status. So there was a fusion here, a fusion in this labor migration policy of Germany in this point of time, very recently, of class or utility and nationalist or identity considerations. And another set of very perceptive migration scholars today, Saskia Bonjour, who is actually a colleague of Hein de Haas at the University of Amsterdam, and Sébastien Chauvin, who works at the University of Lausanne, very close to Bern. They summarize the same observation. They argue in the current, they call it nationalist neoliberal context. They don't call it really neoliberal nationalism. They don't really dwell much on the meaning of this combination here of nationalist and neoliberal. In this context, the policy distinction between cultural and economic criteria is increasingly blurred. And they argue the good citizen, from the perspective of the state who rules over society, selects migrants, is the good citizen is a worker citizen. The worker citizen, that's a term that comes from yet another interesting scholar. I will not go into much of name dropping here. The worker citizen, here it's not really important what, in a way, the passport of that, then metaphorically speaking, citizen is. The worker citizen, an individual who is productive and useful in society, can be either a citizen in the narrow term of passport holding, or it can be an immigrant. Okay, I come back to that theme later. Therefore, I think now we can move to our next slide. And I have to consider time constraints. Would have never thought that. Yeah, I call that constellation that makes sense of these empirical observations. I call it neoliberal nationalism. Generally, one has to say, nationalism is a necessary input factor for all migration policy. Migration policy is a policy that shapes and determines who is to be a member, a new member of our society. And countries, in a way, do this, or states do this membership policy. I follow here a nice argument by the American philosopher Michael Walzer. They select newcomers in the image of who are we. We want to maintain who we are. Immigration policies in the service of maintaining and sustaining communities of character. This is Japan. This is Luxembourg. It's not MacBall. Now, neoliberal nationalism, this new type, is neither civic nor ethnic. These are the two dominant types in the literature on nations and nationalism. Civic, the classic example is France. Ethnic, the classic example is Germany. No, neoliberal nationalism is neither nor. It raises the question, what is neoliberal? Now, colloquial speaking, neoliberal is to economize everything. Not just things, but people included. The famous billionaire investor George Soros spoke of market fundamentalism. If kind of market principles are not just at home in their original domain of the market, but dominate education, dominate politics, even shape the subjectivity of people. To responsibilize, to make the individual self-responsible so that society is not required to intervene. That's a typical motif in that literature that reflects on what is neoliberal, the building of human capital. The idea is if education, previously education was to educate citizens, well-rounded, integrated people. Now the new idea of education, and in particular higher education, is to get a good job, to make myself sellable on the labor markets, to build human capital. So that is kind of, intuitively speaking, the meaning of neoliberal, to economize everything, to spread the market throughout society. Friedrich Hayek, in my view, is the greatest theorist of neoliberalism. He denied the neo. For Friedrich Hayek, what he wrote about in his 50-year writing career, marvelous, productive writer actually, he thought he just reconstructed the original classical liberalism. No, he did not. Hayek was concerned about social liberalism, that liberalism turned into something like social democracy, that it became closely allied with democracy. He hated social justice. He hated welfare. He thought the individual is responsible for herself. And if she fails, there's nobody there to the rescue, except perhaps her family. Individual justice, not social justice. Margaret Thatcher, who brought neoliberalism down from the sky of the philosophers like Hayek to the real world, she said, there is no such thing as society. They are only individuals and their families, and there's no state that people should look for to help them out if they are in need. No such thing as society. That is also a good description of the meaning of the neoliberal doctrine. Here, however, a few self-critical remarks. If you want the general ethics of all of immigration, is neoliberal before the word. One of the earliest provisions in American federal immigration policy, which originated only in the late 19th century, was the so-called deeming provision. Avi Solberg, whom I started with today, wrote very prolifically about deeming. What is deeming? Deeming was the idea that if an immigrant passes Ellis Island, then she had to, or it was mostly a he, even though a lot of families moved at the time as well, find a relative, say in New York, who would sign a little paper, an affidavit, saying, if my relative just coming from Italy or from Slovenia, if she falls destitute, then I will take care of her. That is deeming. In a way, it's a privatizing of social aid. And you see, only if an immigrant to late 19th century America was self-sufficient, economically useful, was she considered if she was sick and the teeth was shown to be inflicted with a disease, you go back anyway. So that was rough and utility-oriented, if anything. So one should be careful not to overdraw the meaning of neoliberal here. All ethics of immigration, in a way, has been neoliberal before the word. I also have to say, neoliberal nationalism, this strange neologism as an ideology, is very strange. This is what Philip Marno said, actually, in a review of one of my earlier books, which was with the title of Neoliberal Nationalism. Why is it a strange compositum to square neoliberal with nationalism? First, the neoliberals, now the doctrinaires like Hayek and Wilhelm Röpke and others, sometimes considered and called the Geneva School, in a great work by the American historian Quinn Slobodian, they were globalists. They didn't like the nation state. They didn't like, nationalism was too narrow for them. They actually feared nationalism, that they feared the nation state, because the nation state is a typical site, and still today, of democracy. People rule themselves. That's the meaning of democracy, the demos rules. And the nation state, in a way, had to be sidelined for capital to move freely and unburdened across borders. The people, the demos, the nationalists were kind of a threat to property, and therefore the Geneva School neoliberals, they looked for new types of polity, like actually the European Union, which were more like an interstate federation, as Friedrich Hayek called it in an early, very ingenious work. And Hayek himself, first, of course, he ranted against anything social and socialist, but he also ranted against, or argued against and mobilized and yelled against nationalism. He called it threat to a free civilization. So one has to put that into consideration here. This is a very bizarre creature, neoliberal nationalism. It grates in the ear. And if you could now move the slide, that is at the level of doctrine. In the real world, however, I think one can observe that thing that I call such, an N for neoliberal nationalism. It is the idea we are a community of the thrifty. Thrifty means productive, useful, not cost factors. And who is excluded here from the community of the thrifty? On the one side, lazy citizens, and on the other side, costly migrants who only come to us for abusing our marvelous social aid and welfare system. So the community of the thrifty excludes lazy citizens, but includes productive immigrants. The community of the thrifty, which is another more colloquial wordage for neoliberal nationalism, blurs the boundaries, the previously strict boundaries between citizens on the one side and immigrants on the other side. No, not yet. No, yeah, stay with that. And policy examples of this real existing neoliberal nationalism is social policy that has recently moved from welfare to workfare. America, Britain under Reagan and Thatcher respectively pioneered that. Gerhard Schröder, German Chancellor, belatedly joined the train. Tony Blair, of course, with New Labour as well in the 1990s. Social policy, I will not say more about that. Citizenship policy is another instance of neoliberal nationalism. There was a moment in not too long ago Europe that citizenship was considered a right if an immigrant fulfilled certain prerequisites, such as residence time or language competence. It was a right if certain conditions were fulfilled. The new rhetoric, roughly since the 1990s, is it's not a right, it's a privilege. It's a privilege that you have to earn. Citizenship is not something that helps you to better integrate. That is the old liberal social notion. No, the new neoliberal notion is citizenship has to be earned. I talk about it in that book, older book of mine, under the title of Neoliberal Nationalism and related articles. And a third example, of course, is immigration policy, the topic of today. Brubaker, esteemed colleague from UCLA, has actually discarded nationalism as an input factor in immigration policy. He thought only citizenship, not immigration policy, is kind of shaped by nationalist considerations. I myself have taken this position in an earlier book, and I will not bother you with that. What I do in the next slide is to simply elaborate on neoliberal nationalist motifs shaping three types of contemporary immigration policy for the high-skilled, family, and asylum. I can be very short about high-skilled migration here. To a degree, of course, its origins are simply the new era of globalization in which there is a race for talent, as my colleague Yelet Shahar put it in a nice article early on. This simply need in a kind of technologically ever more advanced economies for IT specialists, and they are predominantly to be found in Bangalore, India. At least that was the earliest mythology. So there is a very economic consideration here. It's not just a kind of a nationalist, however, neoliberal nationalist consideration. It's both of these factors. We'll not talk about the EU, which is an example of this combination here of economic, knowledge-based economy and identity considerations. We want social cohesion. And indeed, when Elke Winter, I already mentioned her, introduced this notion of middle-class nation building, she primarily exemplified it along high-skilled migration. Canada is an excellent example for that. I will not bother you with that detail here. Read the paper, and I think we can move on to the second type of contemporary migration policy that is shaped by neoliberal nationalist motifs, which is family migration. If you can move the slide. Yeah, generally, of course, family migration I always thought is immensely fascinating, because this is a type of migration that is both individual rights based, and it is something relevant for the interests of receiving states. Family migration happens because families are simply protected entities in liberal state constitutions. However, family migration can also be new seed immigration, as it was called in the 1970s, when Europe stopped accepting guest workers because of the first and most serious economic recession of the post-war era. Then most people actually who were still coming in were the family members of the guest workers. And so there was a feeling that if we allow too many of them, our recruitment stop will simply be undermined. People abuse family migration for continued and then ever more perpetuated new seed immigration. Now, in a social democratic regime, the family would be considered a support factor for, say, male labor migrants who already arrived in a country of destination. It's good for integration. In a neoliberal context, the family is considered not a support factor, but a cost factor. And under this lens, or from within this optic, there have been restrictive trends to cut down family migration since ever it became a rather important new channel for migration. And still today, the majority of migrants who arrive in Europe are not labor migrants, not asylum migrants, they are family migrants. So if you want to get serious about restricting migration, then you have to restrict family migration. And that was done in various ways, raising the income level of the sponsor already residing, say in Germany or in France. She had to show, I earn a lot of money and I can support my spouse and my children. You raise the income levels. You have to demonstrate that your apartment is big enough so that you're not crowded, not as small as the hotel room that I enjoy here in Tokyo. Another restrictive trend is, and that's very interesting, because remember, the dominant trend of this neoliberal nationalism is the blurring of the citizen-immigrant distinction. And previously, citizens had more family rights than settled immigrants. It was easier for them to bring in spouses from abroad, spouses of a different nationality. Also, settled immigrants have certain family rights, but they tended to be weaker and lesser than the family rights of citizens. And in countries like Germany and France, you can see a leveling down of these previously privileged citizens to the level of immigrants. And interestingly, very often driven by the demographic new constellation, that a lot of the claims makers for family formation and family unification from a certain point on, roughly 1990s, were former immigrants, are naturalized French or Germans. So in fact, if you level down citizen rights here in that family domain, you actually level down the rights of previous immigrants. So, okay, this is an interesting trend here. And thirdly, highly interesting is that high-skilled immigrants in European countries like Germany and France, they have more family rights than citizens. And the countries that have been examined in this respect here is the UK, Norway. Also here you see almost certain foreigners are treated better than citizens if it comes to family migration rights. Okay, I don't need the case of Canada here. I can move on to the next slide. Asylum migration. Now, here, there is a trend of economizing asylum migration, which is quite recent and quite new. And it has both a plus and a minus side. The minus side, to begin with it, is this trend to look at asylum migration increasingly from an economistic perspective. It is restrictive for recognized refugees recognized under the Geneva Convention, who are increasingly treated like ordinary labor migrants. Previously, refugees were put on a higher pedestal, that they had more integration rights and more easier residence rights than labor migrants. And it is inclusive. This trend to economize asylum migration is inclusive for rejected asylum seekers. And one must know, in Europe, in most European countries, the number of recognized convention refugees is much smaller than the number of asylum seekers whose claims are rejected, but who cannot be deported, kicked out for other reasons. I go to it in a second. So neoliberal asylum migration means that asylum, to the degree that it's still granted, is no longer primarily a right, but it is increasingly charity. It's done for humanitarian reasons, not for respecting a rights title on the part of the claimant. There's one side to it that is from right to charity, and there's another side to it that is just crudely economistic. The CEO of Daimler-Benz, big German upper middle class car maker, in 2015, which was the moment of the big Syrian refugee crisis, when about 1 million Syrian refugees arrived in Germany, he welcomed that. He said, hey, most refugees are young, they are well educated, they are highly motivated. In response to that big incoming of about 1 million Syrians and others under that same in that same moment, the Germans passed a so-called integration law, simply to adjust the law to the new situation. Interestingly, that was written by the McKinsey consultancy. That is only mentioned here in brackets. And what this new law did is, on the one side, it reduced the rights of recognized refugees. They were now demoted, as I say, to the status of ordinary legal migrants. Permanent residence was no longer given to them automatically after they were recognized as refugees, fulfilling this criteria of political fear of persecution. They had to submit themselves to the usual civic integration tests. If they wanted to have permanent residency, even convention refugees, they had to pass a language test and the civics integration requirement that labor migrants had to undergo. But on the other side, there's kind of the minus side from the point of view of the asylum seeker or the refugee. On the plus side, there was a new legal term introduced in that law. It's called good prospect to remain. And it gives all asylum seekers, in whatever phase of the asylum process they are, from day one on, in a way, if they have a good prospect to remain, and that was simply defined by the probability that she would actually be granted refugee status. So if you came from Syria or from Afghanistan, the recognition right for refugees is very high. So her prospect to remain is very high. Such asylum seeker was immediately kind of given integration support. And finally, there was also a so-called track change for rejected asylum seekers. That's a complicated thing I cannot go into, otherwise I would. I see my time is running here like mad. So summing up, neoliberal asylum migration is double-edged. Economization, this whole prospect to increasingly look at asylum seekers from the point of view of utility, it blurs the labor-asylum distinction. It is good for rejected asylum seekers who are kind of track change to the labor migration track, but it may also create false incentives to claim asylum only in the hope that eventually, okay, my asylum claim will be rejected, but I will be admitted as a labor migrant, as it were. That is the purpose behind track change. I have written about it, and I will not further dwell on it. And the second problematic side here is humanitarianism undercuts the rights basis of asylum seeking. There are several examples to it, which I will not go into because my time is lapsing. There's an Italian scholar, Luca Marvelli, who teaches somewhere in England. He said the connection between these two sides, the double edge, as it were, economization on the one side and humanitarianism on the other side, is there is the reality of a new neoliberal political economy of belonging. That is his word for neoliberal nationalism. Okay, you can move the slide. Yeah, summing up in terms of a question, is neoliberal immigration policy middle-class building or middle-class nation building, as Elke Winter suggests? Yes and no, and in the end, I'm kind of undecided on that. I give you the yes signals. Economic class considerations have held entry across selection criteria, no longer just labor migration, where they were always, but also increasingly in family and in asylum migration. And of course, the whole vision of middle class is a classless vision, a vision of society beyond class, so it reduces the classic tension that exists between class and nation as competing affiliations of people in political terms. So in that respect, middle-class nation building, as Elke Winter calls it, is an instance of what I call neoliberal nationalism, which is indeed centered on this idea of the community, of the thrifty, of the worker citizen. There's a nice formulation of that in a work by the Israeli philosopher, political theorist Yael Tamir. She says, has to be very carefully read here, elites have broken the very first rule of social solidarity: members come first. Because under neoliberal nationalism, certain migrants are even privileged over own citizens. But then perhaps not, perhaps middle-class nation building is not so good a term for these new developments that I empirically elaborated here very briefly. No, because explicit nation-building concerns one does not find in migrant selection, but in migrant integration, which I have not covered here at all. Therefore, I will no longer dwell on that point. You know, the middle class, the Western middle class, is the loser of globalization. You see it in terms of the famous elephant curve of the economist Branko Milanovic. And it would be an ultimately cynical enterprise to kind of rebuild the middle class that has disappeared with respect to natives, to replace it with foreigners. It would actually be a full example of this crazy right-wing phantasma of the grand remplacement, of the great replacement that conspiratorial elites are putting on ordinary, hapless people to let in a lot of immigrants in order for despised co-nationals to suffer even more. This is a topic in radical right political fantasy, la grande remplacement. I will not further go into that. There's another objection to looking at neoliberal immigration policy from the point of view of middle-class nation building. Yeah, indeed. In countries like Canada, even the high-skilled immigrants that they want and wanted as one of the first countries starting in the 1960s, they subject even high-skilled people to a probationary period. You have to test yourself first before you can establish permanent residence. The new reality in Canada is so-called two-step migration. You are first, even if you're super high skilled, admitted on a temporary basis, and you have to prove over time that you deserve to stay here. Catherine Dauvergne, a colleague from the University of British Columbia, a lawyer, she calls that new model the loss of settlement. Migrants are no longer wanted as future citizens, as it was before. No, they're just widgets in the machine of neoliberal capitalism. And all of that, summing it up, to use these grand terms like neoliberal nationalism, like middle-class nation building, it suggests there's a great design, a grand design behind what states are doing. In reality, migration policies in the plural are patchwork. They don't follow a coherent philosophy. There's a lot of contingency and randomness to them. And finally, to my second last slide, the real interest for you, lessons for Japan. Now, in my view, the European challenge is to more clearly and cleanly separate labor migration from asylum migration. Because the recent trend has been to blur the distinction between both. From the point of view, we have 900,000 rejected asylum seekers in Germany. We cannot get rid of them for all sorts of logistical, legal reasons. Better to integrate them. Okay, but if you drive this integration noble intention too far, you create false incentives for people to abuse the asylum process only to find a better life. And excuse me, the Geneva Convention was not written for all the downtrodden and exploited people in the world to find a better life, but it was written to protect those who are politically persecuted. A very narrow focus that should not be abandoned. Otherwise, you abandon just the separate legal regime of asylum and refugee migration. So the European challenge is to separate these two types of migration that have become fused. And that is not an issue in Japan because of your island geographic constellation, you're not overwhelmed by asylum seekers to the same degree as Europeans are. The Japanese challenge actually is to further institutionalize labor migration policies. That Europe have been doing since the roughly early 1990s, since Germany abandoned its old logo, we are not an immigration country. You're 30 years backward in that respect. And your task is to open up to labor migration to the same degree that Germany in the last 30 years has opened up to it. So a completely different constellation in Japan, not comparable with Europe. And the big mistake of the progressives, the left-leaning, most migration scholars are left-leaning, in Europe is to consider asylum and labor migration as communicating vessels. So if you open the tap for labor, then the assumption is you reduce the demand for asylum. That is naive and empirically speaking wrong, because you are dealing with two types of people who are addressed by either asylum or labor migration policy. liberal labor migration always needs to be complemented by restrictive asylum policies. That is the lesson of the last 20 years and the big struggles that Germany and other European countries have with respect to asylum migration today. There's an inevitable goal conflict. On the one side, you have to control migration, particularly irregular, unwanted migration, and sorry to say, asylum migration as it's happening today is part of that, and integration. If you do too much on the integration side, as the German progressives called it, integration for all from day one, then you are opening your country to migrants that actually may become a danger to your security, as the Germans had to experience last year when there were a lot of knife attacks, terrorist knife attacks in public places like supermarkets, Christmas markets, by rejected asylum seekers who should have been deported but were not deported for legal reasons, for sheer oversight of the responsible authorities and other reasons. I think I spare myself the last slide, which is simply laying out the defunctness of Europe's asylum system, something that is in dire need to be fixed. In my view, the inevitable future of asylum in Europe is to externalize the migration, the asylum process to third countries. A total scandal from the point of view of progressive migrant scholar. However, no alternative. And there are several models of doing that. There's a model Rwanda that has failed because high courts in the UK have prohibited it. It would simply ship all those who still arrive on rickety boats, expel them immediately to Rwanda, and Rwanda then is supposed to make an asylum determination process that corresponds to the Geneva rules. And these people, once they are even accepted as refugees under the Geneva Convention in Rwanda, have no right to move on to the UK. Very rough model, very similar to what Australia has actually pioneered in these island outlets west of the continent. And there's a model Albania, what Italy is practicing right now. They build certain detention centers. They ship people who arrive in Italy on boats if they are young and male. And majority of asylum seekers in Europe is young and male and under 35. They ship them to Albania, and there will be an asylum determination process very much influenced by European rules. And if you're successful, actually you are entitled to move to Italy. So it's a very different model. It's a much more generous model, even though it's pioneered by Giorgia Meloni, who is originally a radical right populist politician. She mellowed in office very much. And very importantly, the whole thrust of contemporary European migration policy, and there's a new migration pact that after many years of big struggle between member states has been passed, will come into effect next year, in 26. And one element of it is the so-called border procedure, which would make a very fast-paced determination if someone's asylum request is valid or not. And there will be the fiction that at the border where this whole process is to be started and quickly coming to an end, you are not yet on European or whatever is the member state territory. That lawyers call it the no entry fiction, which is very important because if you have not yet entered European territory, you are not considered subject to national law and European Union law, which is very, very protective of asylum seekers. Because in a way, the reality is, once you manage to put your foot into a European country, you can only with great difficulties be removed. Therefore, if you want to bring back control over the asylum system, you have to neutralize the legal constitutional overprotection that exists as a result of lawmaking and as a result of judicial interpretation, what is the law. And in my view, this border procedure, where you will not be granted entry, and if you are in most cases rejected as an asylum seeker, you are not allowed to move further. To me, this is only an intermediary step to the externalization of the asylum process, where indeed the asylum process will be done outside of the shores of the European Union. This is very controversial reasoning, I'm aware of it. Some of my colleagues who have proposed that there's no alternative to it, like Ruth Koopmans, who teaches at the Science Center in Berlin, they are kind of excommunicated from the overall progressive migration scholar community, if you want to call it that way. I commend the audacity and the courage of people like Koopmans to kind of call the spade by its name. All of these things do not matter for Japan, therefore I will leave it with that. And I finish even 3 minutes before my allotted time. Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah. So, thank you very much, Professor Joppke. So everyone, please give Professor Joppke a round of applause again. どうぞもう一度拍手をお願いいたします。So now, let me invite our next keynote speaker, Professor de Haas, to share his views on the increasingly complex migration issue and his aspiration capability model. So, Professor de Haas, please, you have the floor. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you in Japan right now, but I really hope this still gives the opportunity to share some of the insights of the research I've been conducting over the last 3 decades or so, and in particular to talk about, I was particularly asked to talk about the aspiration capabilities model and what it could sort of teach us in rethinking migration. And this is really a model that, I would say a different paradigm I've tried to develop about migration, because doing my own research, particularly in Morocco, where I've done most of my fieldwork, and other countries in Africa, I realized increasingly that the so-called, the classic migration theories, and particularly the push-pull model, really don't help us much to understand migration, both particularly if we think about the causes of migration, but even the patterns of migration, which we will see. And I've argued in my publications that the model is not only simplistic, but actually quite misleading, and leads us to wrong conclusions about, for instance, how development will affect migration. And indeed, migration is much more complex. And I do think it is very important that we develop a more realistic paradigm on migration, because eventually it will also help us to develop policies that are more realistic. Because we cannot deny the fact that, although I think it is an exaggeration to say that all migration policies failed, in fact, most migration policies work quite well. We are also very much influenced by images we see of boats and people dying on borders, and these are real issues, but we have to see things into perspective. The vast majority of migrants in the world still moves legally, and that shows that quite a lot of the rules and regulations we have about migration actually do work. But on the other hand, we cannot deny that if we look at some aspects of migration, and I particularly think about lower skilled labor migration and asylum seekers, we clearly see that the EU, the US, many countries in the world have been trying to regulate that, but actually haven't been very successful, particularly if we look at the longer term. And I think here it is really important to understand why the so-called solutions that policymakers have put forward don't always work, and in some cases actually have turned out to be completely counterproductive. So that is really why we need to rethink migration. Now, what is this aspiration capabilities model about? It is first of all a different paradigm of thinking about migration. And many of my colleagues and many of my mentors, I mentioned names like Douglas Massey, Stephen Castles, Ronald Skeldon, have already argued very convincingly that the push-pull model doesn't help us much further, and that we need a more sophisticated vision on migration. What I try to do in my own work is try to bring some of that work together and develop a sort of new idea, if you'd like, paradigm, to think about these things. So what does it mean? First of all, it means that we redefine human mobility. If we really want to understand the relation between migration and broader processes of development, we have to see human mobility not so much as the act of moving, but as people's freedom to decide where to live, including the option to stay at home. So mobility then is something different than just migrating. It is a fundamental human freedom. And here I borrow on Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, who defines development as the ability of people to live the lives they have reason to value. And so you could also distinguish mobility freedoms as one of those fundamental human freedoms. If you take that freedom away from people, and I think some of that, almost the COVID crisis, lockdowns were almost an experiment. If you take away that fundamental freedom, and I'm not even talking about migration, but just geographical mobility freedoms, people generally feel deprived. They may agree or disagree with it, but it's felt like a form of deprivation. And it is very clear if you do research in countries that don't have many mobility freedoms. In my case, it was a lot in Morocco and other African countries, that lack of mobility freedom is really felt as a form of deprivation. This is nothing to do with a sort of moral or ethical valuation of it. It's just how it impacts people's mindsets. So, and then the second thing is that I try to propose migration as a function of people's aspirations and capabilities to move. And this is also going back to really questioning this fundamental core assumption that we see in a lot of policy, but also academic narratives, particularly when it is about so-called South-North migration, that migration somehow is this desperate flight from misery, that problems like poverty, inequality, climate change even are the so-called root cause of South-North migration. Now, of course, suffering on the border does happen, and some migrants are clearly desperate. But on the other hand, we do know from a lot of research that for most migrants, migration is an investment in a better future. And migration comes with a lot of resources you need actually to make it possible to migrate. I'm talking about financial resources, but I'm also talking about education, for instance, cultural capital, which will help you in terms of getting visas or residence permits. And of course, social networks will help people to migrate. So you need resources to migrate. And that explains the paradox that the poorest of the poorest migrate less than the slightly wealthier of. And just look around the world, what are the most important source countries of labor migrants over the last half a century or so? We think about countries like Mexico, Turkey, or the Philippines. These are typically not low-income countries, and that is not a coincidence. But the second aspect is about aspirations, and I think that is equally important as the idea that you need a certain threshold of wealth in order to be able to migrate. I can give the example of education. I mean, nobody would contest that more education is good for development, but what we've typically seen in surveys, analysis, is that as soon as people get access to education, primary, secondary, their whole life perspective changes. For instance, if you build schools in rural areas, irrespective of economic conditions, people generally no longer want to be a farmer and generally imagine their futures in the city and different kind of jobs. And this is why we've seen in survey research that increasing education means actually more migration. And this explains this paradox of the migration transition, first hypothesized by Wilbur Zelensky, an American geographer, and further developed by Ronald Skeldon. And I've tried in my own work to elaborate further on these ideas, that if poor countries become richer, migration starts to increase, not to decrease. And it is only after a certain threshold level that emigration starts to decrease, from which point countries tend to transform from out-migration countries to net immigration countries. Now, those transitions have happened in the past to many countries. An example in the East Asian region is South Korea, obviously, but also Southern Europe is a very good example. Countries like Spain and Italy were, of course, quintessential emigration countries, but have become destinations. Ireland is another good example, but I could give many more. But there seem to be new countries appearing on the horizon, the new destination countries. Turkey is a very good example, but also Mexico seems to be developing into a destination country. And a country like Morocco as well sees increasing immigration. At the same time, still many Moroccans leave. So it shows the sort of non-linearity between levels of development and levels of migration. So the discourses we hear often of politicians, for instance, the previous Biden administration, run this root causes narrative. Say, well, the only way we can stop migration, unwanted migration, is to develop poor countries. Well, the evidence suggests strongly that any form of development, whether you think about poverty reduction, infrastructure improvement, or better education, will more likely lead to more instead of less migration. I will get back to that when I'll talk about future scenarios and what we could think about the future of migration. What does that mean? So this is in a nutshell what the aspiration capabilities approach tries to convey. And I'm not going to be overly modest here. I really think we need a paradigm change. The push-pull model will not help us to understand these things. It portrays migration as a one-off move from poor to rich countries. We, of course, know that migration is much more a circulatory process where people go back and forth. And we really need to understand how, for instance, policies impinge on the overall process of coming and going if we really want to develop a scientific understanding of how policies may affect migration, often also in unexpected and unintended ways. What can we think? How can we use this model to think or rethink the way we think about impacts of migration? Well, this was the topic of most of my research in the past, was the whole relation between migration and development. Now, what I actually did in the first 10 minutes of my talk is give a very brief sketch about how development affects migration. And there you can say, well, development, certainly in the early phases, generally leads to more mobility. I'm not only talking about international mobility, but particularly about internal mobility, because I think perhaps it's the best example to illustrate how migration is part of development. And that is really the key insight, I think, to take home. And I'm here quoting Ronald's famous migration scholar, Ronald Skeldon. He ended his book, Migration and Development, with one very simple phrase, which was, migration is development. So that is really the revolutionary sort of insight that Zelensky and Skeldon already brought to the field. That migration is not so much something you can fix with development. Paradoxically, certainly when countries move from, let's say, low to middle income country and go through fundamental transitions, mobility tends to increase. And I think urbanization is the best example. So all societies in the world are urbanizing very fast in the developing world. And it is very difficult to imagine this urbanization without rural to urban migration. And the other way around, it's very difficult to conceptualize even the modern experience of migration without urbanization. And this is not about liking or not liking migration. It's really about understanding how it is a fundamental part of the process. And that also explains why so many attempts by governments to stop or curb rural to urban migration in many developing countries have basically never really worked. Of course, you could mitigate things. You could stimulate development of mid-sized towns and cities in rural areas. But the point is, you cannot stop the overall process of urban growth and concentration of population and economic activities in urban areas. And to a certain extent, I think this is an important insight to take on board when we think about migration. Of course, this whole perspective does not address some other very, really important issues, which I think are very important issues to address if we want to understand, and I'll come back to that in the end of my talk, why policymakers in Western countries or wealthy countries struggle so much with immigration. That is because in the debate there is this almost elephant in the room in terms of the real driver of a lot of migration in the world is obviously the demand for low-skilled labor. Although the paradigm has really shifted on high-skilled labor, I mean, there is this narrative about the global race for talent and countries that try to attract engineers and doctors and scientists. We all know that there is an increasing shortage of lower-skilled workers. And of course, ever since the day of the guest workers and the bracero workers in Europe and in the United States, the demand for low-skilled labor has been a very important driver of migration. So if we don't address those issues, we are going to go nowhere. And I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. Now, so what can we, first of all, the effect or the relation between development and migration is fundamentally complex, obviously, but it is also non-linear. It means that in early phase of development, there's a lot of evidence out there that it actually boosts migration, both within and outside countries. So how could we then conceptualize the impacts of migration? Now, if we think about how migration affects development in origin countries, up to, I think, roughly 2000, 2005, the debate was very much dominated by the so-called brain drain paradigm. And I think we're all aware with the brain drain paradigm, it was a very pessimistic paradigm, which considered the emigration as a basic loss for origin countries. And there have been a lot of debates about whether rich countries that attract those migrants should compensate poor countries for the education they offered to those migrants. And this debate has gone nowhere because this is very difficult to organize and enforce. Also, attempts to stop higher skilled people from leaving have generally entirely failed. So this is very difficult to imagine to be possible to be successful. So we have tried to develop different ways of thinking about this, particularly rethinking the whole way migration affects development in origin countries. Here it is really very important to think about migration not so much as a sort of one-off move between origin and destination, but rather as a circulatory process. And here I think is the issue. We know from a lot of research that migrants leave their countries in order to try to get access, of course, to higher incomes, to better education, and of course, experiences abroad. Now, a lot of migrants initially leave with the idea of either returning to the origin country once they have gotten an education, accumulated certain experiences, and subsequently can go back to the origin country. I think where it often goes wrong is that circulation gets interrupted. And I think here comes in the policy of the destination country. We just know that the more difficult you make it for migrants to come, the higher the tendency is to stay. And this is why in the past we've seen this experience with the guest workers, for instance, that I think well-intended but ill-conceived attempts to stop that migration actually stimulated the permanent settlement of those migrant populations, after which they entered a process of family reunification, and migrants basically stayed and did not return. Now, does that mean that migration is then a net loss for the origin country? Well, not necessarily. Migrants send back a lot of money. We don't know the exact figures because the official figures don't measure what the money migrants and the goods migrants take in cash or sent through informal channels, but remittances are at least 3 times the volume of total development aid. And we know that aid is not really aid. These are basically often loans, and a lot of this money is flowing back to the donor countries. This, you could say, is money that really flows directly from the migrant to the families back home. So some people have branded this as a sort of form of bottom-up development aid. I think this is a naive view because exactly based on the aspiration capabilities model, and this is also what a lot of research shows, that migrants are generally not from the poorest countries and not from the poorest sections of origin countries. So I think we have to be careful not to be overly optimistic about the poverty reduction function of migration, but still, it cannot be denied that migrant remittances and other contributions of migrants back home have a hugely positive impacts on the livelihoods of the families and the communities they come from. That is very difficult to deny. And in many cases, in most cases, it explains why migrants still come, even if they end up in quite difficult situations of being exploited, having no documents. Migrants are in for the long haul in general. And I'm coming back to this initial insight that migration, rather than a desperate flight from misery, for most, it's not a representative vision. Most migrants see migration as an investment. And this is not an investment by individuals, but this is an investment by families and entire communities. And migrants also expect, in a way, to pay back, and many migrants try to come back or invest in origin communities. Okay, so we have to, I think, revise a bit this overly pessimistic view. But on the other hand, I think it is also dangerous to then think that migration can be a fix for problems in destination countries. Clearly, it can't. So although migration has often very positive impacts, if you look at the micro level of the family and communities, it would be a complete illusion that migrants and remittances can overcome structural development obstacles. And like, for instance, failing government, corruption, but also international issues like trade barriers and all sorts of other things that hinder development. So it would be quite naive to think that migrants can overcome this. And to a certain extent, you could say that migration is also convenient for authoritarian leaders, for instance, because it can, as long as people don't go in the street and protest because of a lack of meaningful employment opportunities, for instance, it can be convenient to send people abroad. And this has actually been the policy of many governments. The previous Marcos government, so I'm going back to the 1970s, in the Philippines, you really used migration as a safety valve to lower discontent in the Philippines. So it can really also be a safety valve to avoid a lot of reform. Again, it doesn't mean migration is, if people wouldn't have migrated, reform would have happened. I think these are also dangerous reasonings, but I think we need a more nuanced view. And clearly what we see, I think one thing to say is that and this is more specifically about high-skilled migration, let's not automatically call high-skilled migration brain drain. And my colleague Michael Clemens, who's read a lot about this, I think was absolutely right when he said, let's just talk about high-skilled emigration. Not all high-skilled emigration turns out to be a brain drain. Brain drain is like jumping to conclusions. It's already putting a judgment in the way you characterize a whole group of people. And I think that is damaging. So let's please call this high-skilled emigration from developing countries. I think we have to be precise. Now, of course, in some cases, it can be a drain in the sense of people not coming back, never contributing to their origin countries. But I think it is also very important to not blame migrants for the problems that made them leave in the first place. We know, for instance, about medical migration from Africa, that medical emigration from African countries is not the cause of the healthcare crisis in many African countries. Actually, the healthcare crisis was the reason why many people left, because, for instance, they couldn't find meaningful jobs. And I think quite some governments in sub-Saharan Africa, I think Ghana is a very good example, have actually changed their policies in order to retain more medical personnel and have been quite successful to do so. So let's not blame migration for all the problems that origin countries could witness. I would almost try to say the same about destination countries, because when we hear political discourse in Europe and in America, it almost seems that migration is the mother of all problems. And I'll get back to that briefly. Of course, migration can create problems, and it is not only a good news story. We have to be nuanced about these things. So yes, migration cannot be blamed for structural development problems. We cannot blame the so-called brain drain for structural problems in higher skilled sectors in developing countries, we can, of course, think about what could we do in order to enhance the development benefits of migration, or call it the development potential of migration. And I think, in a way, it's quite clear-cut. Also here, if you try to prevent this migration, the result tends to be backfiring. I always give the following example. The Moroccan government for many years, if a civil servant would move to the West, they would exclude that person from lifetime from civil service as a kind of punishment. Well, it didn't really stop people from leaving. It prevented them from returning, obviously. This is what we often see, that misguided attempts to try to stop things often backfire if you talk about migrants. What you can do, of course, is make things more attractive for migrants, and that is what many origin countries have tried to do. But I think in the case of destination countries, facilitate circulation, I would say. Really think about your policies. If you really want migrants to contribute to development in origin countries, make sure they have rights. If they live on the margin of society, have very low income, they will have very low capabilities. So I'm coming back to these capabilities. They may have aspirations to send money back and invest back home or return, but they simply lack the capabilities. Undocumented migrants cannot circulate, of course, because they will stay put. We know that overstaying is a huge issue. I'm already slipping a bit into policies, and in Japan is a huge issue, for instance. I mean, countries with very restrictive immigration policies that don't address the real root causes of migration, and labor demand is one of them, end up with a lot of people overstaying their visas. But these migrants are also not the type of migrants that go back easily to their origin country. So if you stop circulation, of course, it's going to be harmful for development in origin countries. Now, if you facilitate circulation, I think migration within countries, so internal migration is the best example. Of course, in that case, you will also enhance the development potential of migration. Am I still with you? Can you just confirm that?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted the confirmation. Okay, thank you. So there is no automatic predetermined impact of migration on development in origin countries. I think we have to talk about migration has a development potential. It increases the capabilities of migrants to contribute to development, to enhancement of things in origin countries, of course, starting with their families, investing in housing, investing in education, investing in healthcare, small enterprises. We should never dismiss those contributions. A lot of my research has exactly been about this. I can give you an example. Often migrants have been criticized for building houses in the origin countries, but we also know from research that can actually create a lot of employment in those areas for non-migrants. So there is some trickle down happening in those regions. Can migration solve my development problems? No, obviously it can't. So I think we really have to temper expectations here. So migration cannot be a fix for development problems. So I think that is very important. Now, of course, I was also asked to talk about what migration means for destination countries. Well, this is a huge debate. The book I published 2 years ago, How Migration Really Works, tries to summarize some of that evidence. But I think what we can confidently say is that the so-called pro and anti-migration camps tend to hugely exaggerate the positive or negative impacts of migration on, for instance, the economy. What we, for instance, know about research on the economic impacts of immigration is that by far the biggest effect of immigration is to increase the overall size of the economy. So the whole economic pie simply becomes bigger because migrants are not only workers, they're also consumers. But if we look at the average impact on income, for instance, we see that the effects are incredibly small. So the pie becomes bigger, the average size of every slice stays roughly equal. So I think this again should temper a sort of exaggeration almost of what we can expect migration to contribute. Once we start, and this is just about average impacts, of course, once we start to focus on who benefits most from migration economically, then I think a clear pattern of differentiation starts to appear, which also makes it understandable why lower skilled workers generally are less positive about immigration than the well-off. it is quite clear cut from econometric studies that try to look at the impact of migration on incomes. That is, the already higher incomes reap the most benefits from immigration. And I think this is very easy to understand. Of course, businesses are the prime beneficiaries of the influx of labor, both higher and lower skilled, because it increased their productivity, increased their profits, and of course increased the income of shareholders of those companies. But migrants are just more, migrants of course also contribute to middle class households, but delivering all sorts of services. So here I'm coming back to the key importance in contemporary neoliberal economies with their gig, sort of flexible labor markets of migrant workers. Just think about the whole food sector. Who is harvesting food? Who is processing food? Who is cooking food? Who is washing the dishes in restaurants? Who is delivering the food? Everybody knows the answer in big cities or Western countries. These are predominantly migrant workers. Of course, many other sectors. I just have to think about personal care, cleaning. I already mentioned agriculture, construction. There are a whole range of sectors which have become increasingly dependent on the influx of migrant labor. Now, many middle class households benefit obviously from the services. I forgot to mention, of course, migrants being active in domestic work at home, cleaning and things like that. So middle income households benefit a lot from those services that migrants deliver. The only group that is really not benefiting economically, most studies seem to suggest, is the lowest income earners. Let's say the lowest 10 to 20% of income earners don't benefit from immigration economically. But these are exact the same groups that see the day-to-day consequences of immigration in terms of how their neighborhoods change, how their workplaces change, how they may suddenly be surrounded by people who don't speak the language anymore. So the real impacts of migration in terms of daily lives are felt exactly by those populations that don't see the day-to-day, the economic benefits of immigration. Of course, it doesn't mean that immigrants are responsible for all the problems they are blamed for these days in contemporary Western societies. But of course, it makes it very attractive for populist far-right politicians to exactly suggest that. But I think the pro-migration camp has been blind for the fact that the benefits of immigration are not equally distributed across populations of destination countries. And I think this should really give reason to rethink the way we operate our economies. And to me, it shows a huge paradox. And this is something that many migration scholars, including Stephen Castles, have observed before. There is a fundamental discrepancy between two mega trends in the Western world. The first is the broad tendency towards neoliberalization. We've seen that ever since the late 1980s, the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. This was accelerated after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm talking about a smaller role of the state in the economy, laissez-faire economic policies, but in particular when we talk about migration, the retreat of the state from regulating labor. And here I think we see the hypocrisy in the political sphere. Everybody talks about, lots of politicians we can hear about, we have to fight illegal migration. And I've been hearing it for the last 30 years already. I've come to the conclusion that this is, let me be honest and frank, this is hypocrisy. Because as long as Western societies tolerate that migrant workers are being exploited, and as long as we don't punish and control employers, but only migrants, you can never solve this problem. And many people have already said it. I mean, this is really up for political debate. I'm not a politician. You can basically do two things. Either you regulate labor, you create legal channels, or you reform your economic system so you take away demand for that kind of labor. But as long as we tolerate this happening, people keep on coming. And I've seen this in my recent research in Senegal. People just know that there are jobs in Spain. And the moment you land in Spain, you're going to be tolerated because employers are looking for your labor. And this has been going on for the last 30 to 35 years. This is why, and I think the whole discussion in Europe, I could only hear the last bit of Professor Joppke's presentation, but I think, yes, we need a debate on asylum, but I think the debate is too limited. We need a debate on labor, because we know that apart from refugees, many people cross borders to seek and find work. I think what's happening in the United States is very, very telling. Who is getting punished? Migrants. Are employers being punished? I don't think so. And I think this is exactly showing the hypocrisy. And what these policies do is not very unrealistic to think that the Trump administration is going to deport 11 or 12 million undocumented migrants. It's going to make migrants even more fearful to reclaim rights when they're being exploited. It's going to make their lives more miserable. It's not going to solve the overall problem. So I think states really have to stop denying the reality, and we need a real debate about migration, which is really about the role of labor. And if states want to regulate migration better, they should be willing to regulate their labor markets better. Well, where that debate needs to be going, that is not my task. I'm not a politician, but I think a real debate about migration is a debate about the kind of society we would like to live in. And this is also sort of where I conclude my book with this idea. So what can we say based on this framework about future trends in mobility? Well, I think I don't have a crystal ball, so it's impossible to know what's going to happen. But I think there are some things that seem to be pretty evident. Everything I'm going to say right now is based on the presumption that rich areas in the world, so I'm talking about East Asia, I'm talking about the European Union, I'm talking about North America, the Gulf region, these are really the main sort of migration magnets in the world, will stay wealthy and democratic and thriving. Of course, I cannot know this. If current developments in the US will continue, you may well see a reverse so-called brain drain from the United States to Europe. And this would be quite ironic because we know that that in the days of Nazi Germany, we had this, and up to the 1960s, we had this whole reverse movement of high-skilled people from Europe to America. So these things are very difficult to predict. But particularly if you think about labor, and as we all know, that population aging will not mean that the demand of migrant labor will stop. I think the biggest thinking error migration specialists made back in the 1970s, that they thought that the era of low-skilled labor migration was over. We know this is not true. Still, most migrants are low-skilled workers. They may actually have higher educations doing low-skilled jobs, but because of the increasing education of the domestic workforce, combined with aging, the number of people who are willing to do all sorts of kind of service jobs, because it's no longer so much about industrial and mining jobs like back in the 1960s and 70s, we see this huge increase of migrant workers migration for these kind of lower skilled jobs. So this has been something that will continue in the future. So I'm assuming that this demand for low-skilled migration, lower-skilled migrants will not stop. But here it becomes interesting. If we take on board migration transition theory and the examples I was already giving, and just focusing on Europe here, we could say that the group of countries that attracts labor is increasing. So if we would draw a circle in Europe of core areas that attract migrants, if you would go back to the 1970s, it was a relatively small set of countries in Northwestern Europe. Talking about countries like Germany, obviously, Austria, Switzerland, France, the Benelux countries, not even the United Kingdom at the time, and Denmark and the south of Sweden. These were really the areas that attracted migrants. Now that circle has really expanded, particularly southward, but also westward. So it started to include the United Kingdom, Ireland, Southern Europe. And what we basically see is that the line between net emigration, net immigration countries, which Ronald Skeldon has called the labor frontier, is expanding into Turkey right now. I think it is safe to say that the west of Turkey has been included in that group of countries. We see also increasing migration to North African countries, again, depending on political development, depending on demographic transitions. There is a possibility that those countries will also start to attract more and more migrant labor. Now, the real question is, where will those migrants come from? Well, shifting to Asia, I think it is also quite clear that Japan and South Korea are already beyond the point of denial in which they were perhaps 10 or 20 years ago, that they are effectively, if you look at the numbers, becoming immigration countries more and more so, again, mainly because of lower skilled labor shortages. This is not going to stop. But what to think about China, for instance? assuming political stability in China in the future, it's almost inevitable that China will start to attract more and more migrants. The question is, where will these migrants come from? Mexico is another good example. A country that starts to attract more and more migrants. In the case of Mexico, it's pretty evident. It is going to be Central and other Latin American countries that predominantly will. If you look at the geography of Mexico, that's pretty evident. But if you look at the greater European migration area, if you look at East Asia, where will those migrants come from in the future? The same for the Gulf region. We can already see some trends that seem to suggest, and this would totally fit within the transition models, the aspiration capabilities model, that any kind of development in sub-Saharan Africa and some South Asian countries will increase their immigration potential. And I think it is very likely that migration from those areas will increase, whereas migration from the current main source countries like Turkey, like Mexico, is already decreasing and will probably further decrease in the future as those countries will transform into destination of migrants themselves. So I don't think we're prepared for that at all. I think it is very naive to think that migration can fix these issues. I think it is in a way the same conclusion as for origin countries. The idea that immigration can fix the aging problem, I have a whole chapter in my book about this, that's a complete illusion. Aging is a structural trend that is affecting more and more countries in the world. If you really want to compensate for aging, you need migrant volumes that are probably 5 to 10 times bigger than they're right now. This is neither practically nor politically feasible. So I think that is a complete illusion. But we should also not buy in the other illusion that labor shortages will stop, will no longer be there in the future, particularly on the bottom end of the labor market. And I think that is a real debate we're actually not having. I see a lot of denial in the political sphere. Still many politicians arguing we only need higher skilled workers. I, by the way, object against the word need. I think we need to talk about the labor demand. I don't believe government should always give in the moment employers need certain workers. But if governments basically adopt a laissez-faire attitude as part of neoliberalism, then of course migrants are still going to come because we massively tolerate their labor. When just going back to the United States, we now get these images, and this is very much about projecting an image of toughness. It's really not about migration control. I mean, in the first Trump administration, the number of employers that got criminally prosecuted for exploiting migrant workers was incredibly low, between 15 and 20. So far, I haven't seen any sign that employers will actually be punished for abusing migrant workers. So I think we're still in a state of complete denial, and I think this political hypocrisy is going to hurt us. This is the elephant in the room. What are we going to do with lower skilled labor in the future? I think we really need a real debate about this. Migration cannot solve it, but migration will be part of it. And here also, I really think we need the nuance. Migration cannot fix problems, but we also have to think about how to make migration better work, also for lower skilled members of receiving societies. And here I think we need to stop just seeing migrants as a source of cheap labor, but to realize these are people. I mean, this is the famous citation from the Swiss writer Max Frisch, who said back in the 1960s about Italian workers in Switzerland that, yeah, we wanted workers, we got people instead. And I think we really have to think this through, because the longer we buy into illusions of temporariness, the more problems we will create in the future. Now that brings to me almost to the end of my talk. And this is the fourth topic I was asked to talk about, which is the rise of xenophobia in Western democracies and its impact on migrant capabilities and aspirations. I think this is a real problem. I think what we right now see is that, I already alluded to that. A lot of populist far-right politicians are sort of buying into this idea that migrants have caused many problems that people witness in Western societies, particularly people who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. We talk about increasing inequality, we talk about lower job security, we talk about the lack of affordable social housing, problems in the healthcare sector. Of course, migration can increase or can contribute to pressures in those sectors. But of course, we also know from research that migration hasn't caused those problems. And again, that the causes of those feelings of discontent are rather to be found in neoliberal economic policies that have decreased protection for lower skilled workers, that have dismantled labor rights, that have eroded welfare rights, etc., that have privatized the public housing sector in many Western countries, which have decreased the stock of affordable housing. Of course, it's very attractive for politicians to blame immigrants. But I think we're in a very dangerous cycle where the policies that are being proposed actually don't solve any problem. And I think the real problem is the lack of governments to acknowledge the reality of migration. The reality of migration, which is one of migration will not go away. Migration is not good or bad. Migration is an intrinsic part of our societies. As soon as we start to deny the inevitability of migration in a certain extent, we also will continue the policies that don't solve problems and rather seem to make them worse. And here I think we're in a real conundrum. And the debate is totally stuck. I mean, the United States has been in a deadlock for since 1986, which was the last time under Ronald Reagan there was a comprehensive immigration reform, which was a combination of legalizing 2 to 3 million, if I'm correct, undocumented migrants, plus a whole set of policies that propose to manage migration better in the future. Since then, no immigration reform has been possible. We also see that the debate in Europe is kind of stuck. There has been improvement when you talk about higher skilled migrant students, of course, freedom of mobility within the European Union, so we should also count our blessings. But I think the real conundrum is in how do we deal with asylum seekers and how do we deal with lower skilled migrants? Now, with asylum seekers, I think the only solution is to do things together. I think in Europe we have seen a crisis of solidarity between European countries. And despite all the criticisms one may have on the sort of migration pact in Europe, at least I think it is one big step forward that European nations try to do something together. I'm quite skeptical in terms of the ability to seal off the external border because it is in a way the assumption underlying the pact. But we will see. I think it is very good that we try to forge a common policy, and I think that is the only way forward. But I also think it's a global responsibility. I think many countries don't contribute a fair share to receiving refugees. I do believe that Europe is taking in a much higher share of refugees if you look at the populations in quite some other areas in the world. So I think we also talk about the global responsibility. But numbers are not such that they're unsustainable. I've written a whole paper on this. Refugee numbers on the longer term are actually more stable than we often think. There are often short-term shocks. And in recent, of course, decade, we've seen those shocks, particularly in countries around Europe. And of course, it's triggered a debate. But I do think that there have been steps made forward, and I really hope these will be taken, because just closing the border, that is not a solution. That doesn't give any protection to people who flee, but collaborating within Europe, but also better global collaboration is the only way forward. I think, to be honest, the real conundrum is the continued demand for lower skilled labor, the policies of denial, and I think these can be politically incredibly harmful and even dangerous, in which the so-called fight against illegal migration will become an excuse to attack the democratic state we have, basic human rights. And I think this is the real danger. So I'm coming back to that issue that we really need to address this elephant in the room and the political hypocrisy around migration. And this is more a political end of what I'm trying to say. I think we need a new generation of politicians who dares to step beyond the pro-anti frame, which has harmed us so much. Because how can we talk about migration in pro and anti terms? Because it would be like being against or in favor of the economy. It blocks any sensible debate about immigration. We see a situation in which the pro and anti-migration camp hugely exaggerate the benefits and the downsides of migration. We desperately need a more nuanced approach, and we need a new generation of leaders who is willing to acknowledge the reality of migration. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, Thank you very much, Professor De Haas. Yeah. So everyone, please give Professor De Haas a round of applause again. So thank you, Professor De Haas.